All right, good morning everybody, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we're going to be talking about the Bilateral Complex Finger Tapping experiment. Now this one's a pretty cool one. I know I say they're all cool, but honestly they are all cool. I kind of love psychology. So this one is like our Tuesday webinar or Tuesday live stream. This one is another fMRI style study. Wow, words are hard today. So what participants will be doing in this task is they'll be told to press buttons on a response pad while in an fMRI environment, and they'll be asked to press the buttons on the keypad in a very specific order. Once they press them in that specific order, then they're to repeat that as fast as they can or as quickly as they can until they hear an ending beep. And they're going to go ahead and repeat that process a couple of times. So that's basically the crux of our task. Now we're going to implement a few things to make this task special and to make this task really fMRI compatible. One of the best things, or one of the coolest things I think we're going to do, is we're actually going to change the block duration, or the duration of a block of trials, to line up with pulses in a scanner. Now that is pretty important for people who are running fMRI studies. You know that you need to time out your experiments and time out specifically the blocks of the experiment to line up with the pulses of the scanner. So we're going to be using a little bit of inline script today to show you exactly how to do that. And also what we're going to be doing today is showing you a really cool and up until this point on our live streams, I think kind of a novel way to use the pre-release property in order to log a lot of data at once. So this is going to be a pretty cool live stream. So let's go ahead and start by opening up eStudio. As you can see, I have it open here. It is the latest version of ePrime 3, of course. And I'm going to go ahead and just click on the blank template right here. I just want the blank template just because, we always start from scratch here. So go ahead and select the blank template if you're following along at home. Now, unlike some other webinars, I usually start with an instructions display object, and that's kind of how we always start these things. I'm actually going to start a little different today. I'm going to start with making some stuff in the user script. Now, the reason why I'm starting with user script instead of going back to that later whenever I actually need the script is because I really want to reinforce the idea that anything in the user script is accessed throughout the entire experiment. They're what we call global variables, and these are variables that are going to kind of come up again and again and again and again as I make this task. So this is something that I really want to make sure that I do right away. And of course, this is something that I've made before this webinar, so I kind of know how this task is structured. If you're making this task at home for the first time, or if you're wondering, oh, I have this task to make and where do I start? And sometimes Devon starts with that welcome screen. Sometimes he jumps right into user script, like what do I do? I like to build the experiments kind of from the top down, and really the top or uppermost level of any experiment is this user script right here. So I'm going to just go ahead and add some script into here. So I'm going to make these global variables just by double clicking on that user script right there. Now the variables here are actually just going to be used to track how long our entire trials are, so how long our blocks are. So I'm going to actually make one variable here. So it's just called ln start time. This little ln in the front is just a really brief kind of nomenclature kind of thing for script, just to let everybody know that this variable here is a long variable type. So ln's kind of that shortcut, and then the rest of it's pretty descriptive. So it's ln start time, which is going to be the start of my block. Now I'm going to make another one here, and it's going to be just ln end time. So I still have that ln end time, or that ln in there, just to let you know that it's a long, and then end time. So this is when my block is going to end. So these two variables here are going to be exactly how I control how long my block is going to be once we actually get into that user script. And then I have one more variable to make, well, two more actually. So this variable here, the start time and the end time are going to let me know exactly how long the trial should run for. This block duration is going to be something very similar. It's going to let me know, okay, well this block is supposed to be this long. It starts at this point, and if it's supposed to be this long, then the end time is actually going to be here. And we're going to be doing a lot of accessing of ePrime's internal clock in order to get these values here, and this block duration is going to help me to determine the end time based on when the clock is. And I'll show you guys how to do that. Trust me, it's a little easier than it sounds. I know sometimes it sounds a little complicated when you say it out loud, but honestly, just talking about script like that is a good way to impress people at very nerdy cocktail parties. And then I'm going to make one more variable here. So I have three variables here that are of long type. Now long is just going to be a number. So obviously these are going to represent timestamps in E prime, and the long variable here is just meant for, or is meant to be a larger number that can hold, the contents of a very long string of numbers. Now this Boolean variable that I just made, this bool block end variable that I made, defined it as a Boolean. Booleans, I honestly like to think of them when I first started scripting as kind of a light switch. So it's either true or false. It's either on or off. And then this is something that I would set a little later. Now what this is going to do is it's going to control whether or not I need to end my block of trials. Because as you're going to see a little while later, a lot of the timing of my trials isn't necessarily going to come from the timing of my e-objects. It's really going to come from the timing of some of my inline script. And I am going to kind of take the easy way out and taking some of the inline script and putting it into the experiment here, just because I don't really want to have to type all this out because it's going to end up being long and boring for everyone. But I will go through every line of script just to make sure that everybody knows. But this little variable here is going to be really important for determining when we're going to be exiting our block of script to make sure that our timing is perfect for these trials. So these are really the only four variables that I'm going to need when I'm making my startup info. Or sorry, when I'm making my experiment here. They're going to be set at the very top of the experiment so they can be accessed throughout the entirety of it. So let's go ahead and actually access some of them. So I'm going to go into my session proc here, and the first thing I'm going to add is just an inline object right here, and I'm just going to call it initialize. And this is just going to be the very first thing that my experiment does whenever it runs here. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking those variables that I had just created in the user script right here, and I'm going to be giving them initial values. So I'm going to be setting them to something whenever it starts, just so they're not hanging out and not being, whatever their default happens to be. So I'm going to go into this initialize here, and I'm just going to say that ln start time is going to be equal to 0. That ln end time that I had created up there is also going to be equal to 0. I'm going to go ahead and set that length block duration. I'm also going to set that one to 0. And I'm going to go ahead and set that bool block end equal to false. Now, if you notice when I start typing things here, they turn different colors. So my numbers here are turning purple. My false is turning orange, or I think that's yellow, one of those two colors. The reason it's doing that is because of a feature that we have in E prime called script sense. Now, if you don't necessarily like script sense, or you find that the colors are distracting or anything like that, you can definitely turn that off. And the way to turn that off would be to go to Tools, Options, Script, and then you would just use the syntax highlighting, which this syntax highlighting is what you see right there. So false is kind of a Boolean, so they'll show up in orange. The number literals are going to end up being purple, those types of things. But you can actually turn that off. You can turn off these line numbers here, and you can turn off script sense, which is our autocomplete function, which I'm actually going to be using pretty heavily today. So you have the option to change those on or off. And I mean, if you want to be a little whimsical about your font, you can click on change font, and you can actually change the font of whatever is in these inline objects to whatever you want, just for customized sake, or the sake of customization. I think Consolus looks good. It looks very computery, so I kind of keep it like that anyway. But know that we do allow that level of customization in E prime as well. So now that I have my initialize inline, now I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar off like I do every other webinar that I've ever made, and it's just going to be a very simple introduction slide. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of these windows here, jump into my session proc, and just after initialize, I'm going to take a text display object, and I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to instructions display, and hit enter. Now I'm renaming it to instructions display just because obviously this is going to be used to display instructions. Let's go ahead and double click on it, and I'll just type out some pretty simple instructions. I'm actually, if you've been following these live streams, I'm actually pretty bad at typing and speaking at the same time, so I'm going to type them all out and then read them to you. Oops. All right. So pretty easy text. I only managed to mess up once, which is honestly, if you've been following these, pretty impressive. So this is a test that measures your reaction speed and accuracy. Please respond quickly as quickly as possible, but try to be as accurate as possible. However, don't worry if you make a mistake. Try not to correct an error. We will begin with a practice trial. Press any key to begin. So again, just some very basic instructions for participants. We're not going to get into the exact buttons they need to press just yet. We'll make another instruction screen for that, of course, but that's going to come a little later. Just very, very basic instructions to let them know that, hey, this is, about speed and accuracy. Try to be very quick. And one of the most important things, especially like the webinar that we had done on Tuesday, that try not to correct an error line there is important to include, because the point of this task is you're pressing buttons in a very specific order. If you press a wrong button and then try to go back and correct it, you end up shifting where you are one up. So, let's say you had to press 1, 3, 5, and you press 1, 5, and then go back and then go to 3 and 5, then that's going to completely mess up that order of the buttons that you're pressing, and that's going to make, it's going to make everything a lot worse when you try to analyze the data here. So basically, it's good to tell participants, hey, you make an error, just keep moving on, get better from there. And then we will begin with a practice trial. I also think that's important. So we're going to go ahead and change the properties of this, though. It says press any key to begin, and I put being. So that was 2 errors. There we go. So press any key to begin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page here and click on that duration input tab. I'm going to keep the instructions up for for as many milliseconds as they need. So I'm going to put the duration to infinity here. Turn my data logging to time audit only, and I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. Now, this input mask here is really dependent on the device that you're using to have participants respond in the MRI environment. I know the PST makes a device called Celeritis that is really great at maintaining millisecond accuracy in an fMRI environment. We definitely do recommend that, but if you happen to have your own type of button response box, please feel free to implement that however you do whenever you're doing this type of implementation. For this sample, since we don't assume that everyone has a Celeritis and we don't actually know the kinds of response boxes that everyone has, we just keep it very generic, and we just keep all of these input masks set to keyboard, and you can add your own input mask whenever you want. But all of the response options and all the input masks we'll be doing today is all going to be keyboard based, just to keep it as generic as possible. So I'm going to add that keyword input mask. I'm going to keep my allowable set to any. We don't necessarily need a correct answer, and we are going to be changing the time limit and end action property of a few other objects in the experiment, but for now we're going to keep these at their default. I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK to save these changes. And that's all we need for the instructions display. All right, so the next thing that we need here, and I'm just going to close out of these windows just for the sake of simplicity, the next thing we're going to need is the block list. Now, this block list is what we're going to be using to differentiate between the practice block and the critical block of trials here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on session proc. I'm going to add a list object here, and I'm just going to go ahead and rename this one to block list. Now, I've spoken almost ad nauseum about the necessity of the block list and the session structure. I'm not really going to go into that anymore. If you have any questions about that, definitely check out my other live streams, because I do go into that, in pretty decent depth there. So I'm going to go ahead and open my block list. And for procedure, I'm actually going to make 2 procedures. The first one is going to be probably my favoritely named one, is prac block proc, because it's so hard for me to say. And the other one is going to be my block proc. So to make prac block proc, I'm going to go ahead and in my procedure here, I'm just going to type prac block proc. I'm going to hit enter. It says it doesn't exist. Would I like to create it? Of course I would. Would I like to make the default value for new created levels? I'm going to say no, because I just said I want 2 procedures here. So if you look in the experimental timeline here, you'll see that my prac block proc is now created right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on the add level button here, and I'm going to make a block proc. I'm going to hit enter. It doesn't exist. Would I like to create it? Of course I would, or I wouldn't have typed it. So then I'm going to go ahead and jump back into my block list. Now, typically, in a lot of the other tasks, this is where our editing of the block list kind of stops. It's made to build, the basic structure of the experiment. You say, okay, I have it. I'm done. I'm moving on. But this time it's going to house a little bit more data. And the data that it's going to hold this time is actually going to be relevant throughout the entire task. Now, we could technically set all of this information at a lower level list object, but we really don't need to. Basically, the way that this task works is participants have to push buttons in a certain order. I'm actually going to set that order up here in the block list. I could set them at a lower level, but since that order really doesn't change, and since the correct responses that they're pushing doesn't change, I don't really need to differentiate anywhere in any of the lower list or lower level list objects. I just need to have these attributes, and since they're at the block level, everything underneath the block level can actually see these attributes. So I want to go ahead and make them up here. So the first one I'm going to make is I'm going to make an attribute that handles all of the correct responses for the left button response unit. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this one correct answer left. Now, correct answer left isn't actually going to change between practice and critical block. That would be a really bad practice if it was. So what I'm going to do is my correct answer left is just going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, this is just the way that these keys would be mapped on a generic button response unit. So let's say like 1, 2, 3, and 4 for your index finger, or 1 for index finger, 2 for middle finger, 3 for ring finger, 4 for pinky finger, those types of things. That's just, you know, the generic type of layout that we have here. This is where you'll need to alter for your experiment if you have a different button layout for your left hand response unit. I'm just going to go ahead and keep that at 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make one more attribute reference, and you probably guess what this is going to be. It's going to be correct answer right, because we have 2 button response units. They'll be responding with both hands. Now this one is just going to be 6, 8, 7, and 9. Is 6, 8, 7, 9. I should write that one. 6, 8, A, 7, and 9. There we go. So 6, 8, A, 7, and 9. There we go. And you know what? I'm actually going to change this too. So right now for correct answer left, I just have them press 1, 2, 3, and 4. It doesn't really quite get at the essence of this task, so that's just kind of pushing buttons in, you know, a very easy order. 6, 8, A, 7, and 9 has you jumping around, and that's really the point of this task. The point of the bilateral complex finger tapping task is that it has to actually be a complex sequence, and 1, 2, 3, and 4 doesn't reflect the same level of complexity as that 6, 8, A, 7, and 9 does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this one, and it's going to be 1, 3, 5, 2, 4. That way we're using all buttons on that button response unit there, and we actually are alternating the buttons. And then I'm going to actually describe what those are in a little bit greater detail in my in one of the instruction slides here. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add one more attribute reference, or one more attribute. And this attribute actually shows up in a couple of our older samples, and sometimes it confuses some users as to why we put it there. But this one's just called practice. We used to put in our all of our other samples something called practice mode. It was just an attribute reference, and we'd set it to either yes or no. And in this case, I'm going to set it to yes for the first row and no for the second. But just know that this isn't necessary to put in here to denote that you're doing practice. This is just really good for your data file to, you know, really easily kind of parse out where the practice stops and the critical trials begin. So, you know, this is what we're going to put in here, and it's, you know, it'll make it pretty easy once we check out our data file to see where the practice ends. So that's why we have that in there. We're going to keep the samples here. We're just going to keep that at 2, and we're going to keep that at sequential selection. That way they don't actually accidentally do the critical trials before they do the practice trials. Otherwise, that would be the worst kind of practice if it came after the critical trials. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close out of this list object because it's really all I need to change here. And I'm going to go ahead and open up this prac block proc. Now, our prac block proc, again, that's hard for me to say, is actually going to begin with some instructions. And I'm going to go ahead and just make those really quickly. This is where we kind of get into the meat of the task, so how they're going to be responding. So I'm going to take a text display object and add it as my first object on the prac block proc. And I'm just going to rename this one to prac block instructions, which is honestly way easier for me to say than prac block proc. I'm going to double click on this to open it. So now I need to actually describe the task to the participants, and this is actually going to get into the nitty gritty. So I'm going to do what I had done last time and just kind of type this out quick and hopefully minimal spelling errors. Yeah, there you go, spelling error. Five, 2, and 4. we go. And I'm actually going to put some spaces between here so they look a little nicer. Maybe not that many. There we go. All right, got it. So after a little bit of struggle here, it says you will see a fixation followed by an auditory beep. When the beep occurs, start pressing 1, 3, 5, 2, and 4 on both hands. So 1, 3, 5, 2, 4, and we actually have the finger mappings underneath here. Now, if your task is going to differentiate, you'll obviously need to change this as well. And fortunately, if your task is going to have a different sequence of key presses, the task will only really change here and in the block list. And that's really the only changes you'll have to make to this task. So we try to make these as kind of like a template so it's really nice and easy to use. So that ends up being the left pinky / right thumb, the middle fingers, the left thumb and right pinky, the left ring and right index finger, and the left index finger and the right ring finger. So pressing in that order. And it says repeat the sequence of keys as quickly as possible. You will hear a beep again when the trial is finished. Press space to begin the trial. Now, I'm saying press space because this is something that'll have to be advanced by the researcher. If you want to press space, obviously there isn't going to be a space bar in the MRI environment itself. You can alter this part to make the participant want to move on as well, but we have it controlled by the researcher here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we'll click on the properties page, hop on over to the duration input tab, change duration to infinite again. We'll change data logging to time audit only, and we're going to add a keyboard input mask. I actually got that error because if you go to add and click on something that isn't a device, it'll give you that error. Let's go ahead and click on that keyboard input mask, and my allowable this time is actually just going to be space. And correct answer is just going to be blank for now. I'll go ahead and click apply and OK. All right, so now that we have our prac block instructions, let's go ahead and make a list object. Now we're going to make the list object because this is actually going to be the start of the trials. The block list just denoted, hey, now we're in the practice block, so now we just need to make an actual block for our trials. So let's go ahead and take a list object and just drag it and drop it into your experimental timeline like I did right there way too fast. And let's go ahead and rename this one just to prac trial list. And of course, this is just because it is under our practice block, and it's going to be the trial list for that. Now, this one is actually going to be the one that looks really, really boring in comparison. Usually, our block list is a boring one. Our prac trial list ends up having all of our independent variables and being pretty beefy. We don't really have independent variables in here. We're just tracking the finger presses. So really, all we're going to do in here is we're just going to change this one to prac trial proc. Under procedure, we'll go ahead and create it. And why not make it the default value for newly created levels? And we're just going to keep that the way it is. I mean, we're going to keep it at 1 cycle equals 1 sample. We're not really going to change anything aside from this. So that's all I need to do there. Now, the prac trial proc is, of course, going to get a little bit more complex than it usually does. So the first thing I want to be consistent with my instructions is I want a fixation object. Now, the fixation object can just go right here, just as a text display object in the very beginning. We're going to go ahead and rename this one to fixation. We'll be using this a little bit later as well. And the fixation object, for those of you who are, have been following along for a while, we're going to go ahead and just add a plus sign at the top of the screen. Again, keep in mind that in my properties page here, since my align vertical and align horizontal properties are both set to center, it's not actually going to show up in the top of the screen at runtime. It's actually going to show up in the center of the screen like that says. And I'm going to change my duration input here just to 500 milliseconds. There we go, not 505. And I'm going to change my data logging here to time audit only. Now keep in mind you don't necessarily need to log data for the fixation object. I just like it. I like to have more data than I need, especially like if I end up running this task and it ends up being a variable duration, or my block of tasks isn't exactly lining up with my scanner pulses. I like to make sure that I'm logging data for absolutely everything to see where any delays might be happening, and if the delays are happening there, how to kind of mitigate those. I'll go ahead and click OK. So after my fixation, I want to actually add that start beep. So I'd mentioned here 2 beeps, one at the start, one at the end. I want to add my start beep. Now, if you notice, I haven't actually saved my task yet. And in order to reference a file in ePrime, the ePrime file, or the .es3 file in this case, needs to actually live somewhere, and it doesn't live anywhere yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to give it a home by saving it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on File and click on Save. And I just like to save these to my desktop. I'll go ahead and make a new folder here. Or actually what I'll do is I'll make a folder on my desktop first. New folder, and I'm just going to call this one Finger Tapping Task. There we go, and that's where that's going to live. And I'm going to go ahead and save that one more time. Go into my desktop here, and I'm just going to save this as Finger Tapping Task. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now, I also need my sound files. And if you notice there isn't anything in there, I actually have them. There we go. So I actually made the experiment earlier, like I said, and I'm going to use this beep end and beep start object. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to paste them right into the same folder as my finger tapping task. Now, I think this ends up making the experiment design look a little nicer, honestly. Just because whenever I go to reference these sound files, I don't have to put in a pathway or put in a subfolder or a directory. If you like to do things that way, that's completely fine. I know I just like to have them in the same level as that ES3 file. So now that I know I have my 2 sound files, I'm going to go ahead and close out of these windows here, open up my prac trial proc, and then just add a sound out object. Now the sound out object is going to go just after fixation 1. And I'm going to rename this one to something a little bit more descriptive, like sound out begin. That way, whenever I look at the data associated with this object, I know that it's a sound out object, and I know that it represents the beginning of the task itself. Now, my file name can vary if I want it to. I can actually make an attribute reference here and put it in a list object, but it's just one sound object, and it's never going to be anything different. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to click on that folder icon. And if you notice, it opened up that finger tapping task folder that I made on my desktop just now. And I just want to reference beep start. And it auto formats that for me, just beep start.wave. I'm going to go ahead and click on this general tab here, and I'm actually going to have this stop after property set to yes. And I want to have this end sound action property. I'm going to set that one to terminate because I don't really want this object to remain on the screen any longer than the sound is being played. Now, keep in mind that the sound out object doesn't actually draw anything to the screen, but I don't want ePrime kind of hanging on this object longer than it needs to. So if I set my end sound action to terminate, I'll click apply here, go to my duration input tab and set this to infinite and set my data logging here to standard, but don't add an input mask. From this view here, it looks like ePrime is just going to hang on this object and it's never going to move on because I have my duration set to infinite and I have nothing in my input masks. But if I hop over to my general tab here, since I have an end sound action of terminate, this sound out object is actually going to move on as soon as the sound's done playing, and it'll remain on screen, or this device or this object will remain active until that sound is done playing. That's kind of a cool little way to make the object the exact duration of a media file that you want without having to sit down and go, okay, this file is exactly 8 seconds. What is that in milliseconds? And then put it in the duration input tab there and hope that it lines up well. This is a way to guarantee that this object is only there for the exact duration of it. All right, so now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and that's really all I need there. Now, I'm going to do something that's going to look a little silly at first, but it's all going to make sense a little while later. So since this is, like I said, a complex finger tapping task, there's a couple of things that we're going to need to do with some input masks in order to correctly log each and every one of the button presses and to make sure that they're pressing them in the correct order. To do that, I'm going to actually need to make an entirely other procedure. And to make that other procedure, I need a list object, and I'm going to put it just after my sound out begin. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one, and this one's just going to be subprac list. Now, if you were following along with the webinar yesterday, or sorry, on Tuesday, we actually ended up making a sub trial level as well. So we're actually just making another one, and we call it subprac list because the sub trial is what happens under trial. Now, unlike a lot of the other webinars that I do, and unlike some of the flow of the other webinars, I'm not actually going to jump in and start editing this just yet. I will, but that's going to be kind of the more complex part of the webinar. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and add another sound out object just after this list object. And this one I'm just going to rename to sound out end. And this is what's going to handle our end sound. So if I double click on it to open its properties and click on this folder icon here, I can play an end sound by putting a file name here for my beep end.wave. And I'll go ahead and do the same change here. I'll change my end sound action to terminate, change my duration input tab here to infinite, and my data logging to standard. And then go ahead and click apply and OK just to verify that I'm done. So now what I have here is I have a begin sound and I have an end sound, and everything in between that's going to be in this list object is going to represent the entirety of my quote-unquote trials. So this is where participants are going to actually be pressing the buttons. So let's go ahead and jump into my subprac list here, and this is actually going to be just really simple. It's just going to be subprac. Doesn't exist. Would I like to create it? Yes. Would I like to make a default value for newly created levels? I'm not going to make any more levels, but I'll hit yes anyway because it's the easiest one to do. And I'm going to change my weight here to 3. Now I'm changing the weight to 3, so it'll actually run through this 3 times. Participants have 3 chances to press that. So it's not necessarily just me going, oh, you ran through this task once, you press 6 buttons, we're done, we're moving on. So we're going to go into the subproc here, and the first thing we're going to do is we need to set up 2 input masks. We need to set up an input mask for the left hand and an input mask for the right hand, because while you can technically have all of these on one input mask, they're going to be pressing different buttons. And if you remember back to our block list here, we have a correct answer sequence for our left hand and a correct answer sequence for our right hand already. So since we have those sequences set up like that to be differentiated by hand, we actually need 2 input masks. Now, this may be the first time in a live stream I use this object, and I'm actually pretty excited about it. The first object we're going to use is in fact going to be a weight object. Now, the weight object doesn't draw to the screen either, like the sound out object does. There's nothing that actually draws to the screen. If you use the weight object with any sort of duration, what it's actually going to end up doing is it's going to end up looking like the experiment froze for a temporary amount of time. But the real benefit of these weight objects is to make an input mask that lasts beyond its duration. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So I'm going to go ahead to start editing this. I'm going to rename weight 1. And I'm just going to call this one record write. Because really the purpose of this isn't to pause the experiment, which is, one of the more functional uses of the weight object. It's actually just to record all of the responses made to the right hand unit. And I'll go ahead and double click on it to open its properties. Now, notice there isn't a visual component. These literally are just the properties page of every other task here. Now, as far as the duration's concerned, I'm going to actually set the duration of this object to 0. Now, even though it's set to 0, E' is still going to encounter this object, and it's still going to end up processing any input masks that I put on this object, which is exactly what I want to do here. I'm going to change my data logging to standard because responses are, of course, going to be made to this object, and I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. Now, I know, for some of you that are new to E', you say, well, if there's 0 duration, how do they have any time to respond to the keyboard? That's when the time limit property comes in. So duration and time limit, despite sounding similar, are actually 2 very different functions. The duration function lets you know how long this object is being processed on E' screen or in E'. And the time limit actually is tied to the input mask. So the time limit lets you know how long this input mask is active and how long participants have to respond to this input mask. If I keep it the same as duration, it's going to show up and immediately go away, and participants will have no time to respond to it. However, if I set it to end of proc, participants have the entire length of this subproc procedure to respond to this object, which is exactly what I want. Now, for my allowable here, what I'm going to end up putting for my write is I'm going to put 6, 7, 8, 9, and A. Now, keep in mind, I know that that's different than the sequence that I had set in my block list here. So if I go ahead and jump into my block list quickly, or actually a fun thing I could do is go over to my browser tab, or go over to my attributes tab here. I have these two attributes, correct answer right and correct answer left. So all I need to do for my correct here is just make reference to this attribute. So this is correct answer right. Now, if you notice, my correct answer right there has a couple of options to respond to it. So I need to actually press them in a very specific order, but I need to press all of them. Now, by default, these input masks only allow you to press one button at a time. So to change that, let's change how many you're allowed to enter. And you can do that by clicking on the Advanced tab, and we just change this max count property from 1 to 5. That way participants have to respond 5 times with a button response unit, and they can actually reach that correct answer right that I had mapped out earlier. Now, the only other thing I want to change here, and this is going to help us with script a little bit later, is I want to set the end action from terminate to none. So whenever participants reach this max count of 5, instead of terminating this object, which, I mean, it's already off screen anyway, and the EEPROM's already passed it, it's actually not going to do anything, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK to save those changes. And then now that we've made our record right, we're actually going to now make our record left. So technically, I could make another wait object if I wanted. But if we think about this task visually speaking, the only visual part that I've drawn since prac block instructions is the fixation object. So at this point, the fixation object is on the screen, and we don't necessarily want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a slide object, and the purpose of the visual component of the slide object is just going to be to clear the screen. I'm actually not going to put anything on the slide object at all. It's just to make sure the screen is white for participants while they respond using the buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this one. This one was record right, so this one's going to be called record left. There you go. Double click on it to open up its properties here, and like I said, I'm going to keep the screen completely blank just because I want to make sure the screen is blank for this task. I'm going to go ahead and hop over to the duration input tab, and I'm going to change the duration on this one to how long I want them to be able to press all of these buttons, especially if they're thinking a lot about it. And I'm actually just going to change this to 20,000 milliseconds or 20 seconds. I'm going to set my data logging here to standard, which is exactly what I want. That way I can, see all of the time audit properties as well as the response properties. I'm going to add another keyboard input mask, and then unlike my last one, this is actually going to deal with my left-hand glove, and the responses to that one are 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And then my correct answer is just going to be the opposite attribute that I had made earlier, so it'll be correct answer left. Now, very similar to my record write object, I'm going to set my time limit to end of proc. But since this is kind of the last object that I have to press all the buttons, I don't want to set my end action to none. I want to keep it at terminate here. But like the last object, I want to click on advance and change my max count here to 5. Go ahead and click apply and OK. That way, I have the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They can actually press all of those buttons on this instead of just one and it terminating. So we'll go ahead and click apply and OK. And that's really all I need there. Now, these are pretty basic, but I want to add a little bit more data logging, and I want to add a little bit more of that. I said, I want this to run for a certain amount of time. I want to actually implement that part into the experiment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an inline object here, and I'm going to put it just after my record left, and this one's going to be called check responses. Now, this was the inline object that I said was going to take a lot of time to write. So what I had actually done a little earlier is I made just a very simple text display a very simple text with the script that I need in there, and I'm just going to copy and paste here. So looks like a lot. I promise it's not that much, and like I said, I'm going to go ahead and run through this line by line to make sure that everybody kind of understands what I'm doing here. So what I did is first, and I have a lot of comments on here, so while I don't make too many comments in the live streams, this experiment is going to be available in the experiment library with way more comments than you could ever need for every single line of inline script, because we want you guys to really understand what these tasks are doing. So first, this loop will run continuously or until response has been received by the stimulus object. So I just have a very simple loop here, starts here and ends here, and it's just do while record right.input mask is pending or record left.input mask is pending. So it's literally just sitting here and it's reading in this loop here. And it just says, okay, are we waiting for all of the responses to be made to either one of these two? If we are, let's stay in this loop. And then what it's doing is says, check if the clock.read value has exceeded the overall time limit for the block. And we're really only interested in this for the test procedure, not the practice procedure. So there's just this, if clock.read is greater than that ln end time, which I had said earlier, and this attribute that we had made called practice is set to no. Since it's set to yes, it's actually just going to completely ignore this part. So this is going to be set to yes. E prime is going to go, oh no, it's set to yes, and it's going to jump here, and it's just going to keep looping. So this loop is actually just to kind of hold E prime until the right or the left button response unit has made a response. And then what it's going to do is it's actually going to save the block duration. So the block duration is going to be clock.read, so the time right now, minus that ln start time. And this is going to be one of those things where, you know, yeah, that's going to be really nice to have for our critical trials. It's not going to mean too much for our our practice trials. And then what it does here is I have terminate the trial list, so no more trials are run. So I just have that sub list that I had made here, and you know, just as a little piece of editing. When I made it originally, I called it sublist, but if you look here, it's called subprac list. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this one subprac list. So subprac list dot terminate. So I'm just going to go ahead and exit out of my subprac list once we've gotten here. So once all the responses have been made, we are done. And then I'm going to go ahead and set feedback. This is for practice. So if practice mode equals yes, then record write response is going to set the resp is going to be set to correct right, and the left will be set to correct left. So this is just some data logging for later. So if they've responded correctly on both of those, we'll go ahead and set the feedback display one active state to correct. Otherwise, the active state is going to be incorrect. And so that's really all the script's doing. Very easy script. If anyone has any questions about that, please feel free to send me a message in chat. But like I said, it's some pretty simple script here. So the only other thing I need to implement, you look here, it says feedback display on active state. I don't have feedback display yet, so we'll go ahead and add it. To do that, we'll go ahead into our subproc here. We will add a feedback display, and the script here references the feedback display as feedback display 1. So I'm actually not going to change the name of this feedback display despite the fact that I sometimes do. Correct looks great to me. Incorrect also looks great to me. I'm going to go into this properties page here. My input object name in this case is going to be, we'll call it record write right now. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and check this use script activation checkbox. Now the reason I'm checking that is because my script is actually going to determine what I'm doing to this object. So it's going to determine whether correct or incorrect shows up. So I'm going to check that use script activation just to make sure that, you know, it's parsing it correctly and it's not actually just looking at what this input mask is. And keep in mind that despite the fact that I just pointed my feedback display object at only the record write, I'm actually in my check response inline looking at both record write and record left responses in order to set the correct active state. So, you know, this is something that at first is going to seem a little unintuitive because in feedback display I only reference one of the hand units, but because of this inline object I can actually reference both. And that's actually all we need in order to make our practice list for this task. So the rest of it is actually going to be pretty easy. We're going to go ahead and make our critical procedure, which is going to look exactly like our sub procedure here or our practice procedure, just with a few more pieces of inline script. And primarily these pieces of inline script here are actually just going to function as a way for us to go ahead and just make sure that our trials are timed correctly. So it's not like these inline scripts are even going to be too terribly complicated. So the first thing I want to do is go into my block proc here, and I want to add just very simple block instructions. Just letting them know, hey, thank you very much for completing practice, you know, something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename this one to block instructions. And that's always something that kind of that I struggle with a little bit with ePrime sometimes, is in my mind, practice trials are here, critical trials are here. They make sense because they're separate in ePrime. But whenever participants run them, they don't see that clear division between practice and critical trials. That's why it's important to put these kinds of things in here so they know that the practice trials are over. So I'm going to go ahead and just type basically the same thing I did for my prac block instructions, just with some, you know, an extra line of text in there. you will see a fixation followed by an auditory beep. There you go. Go ahead and save that. When the beep occurs, start pressing keys 1, 3, 5, 2, and 4 on both hands. That is left pinky, right thumb, middle fingers. I'll keep that capitalized. There we go. There we go. Sorry for that typo there. So it says, we will now begin the real task. You will see a fixation followed by an auditory beep. When the beep occurs, start pressing keys 1, 3, 5, 2, and 4 on both hands. That is left pinky, right thumb, middle fingers, left thumb, right pinky, left ring, right index, right ring. Repeat the sequence of keys as quickly as possible. You will hear the beep again. When the trial is finished, press space again to begin the critical trials. So that's all we need. Go ahead and add one more input mask here. We're going to go ahead and set duration input. We're going to change that to infinite. Set my data logging here to standard. We're going to go ahead and add a keyboard input mask, and we're going to set that allowable to space. And then hit apply and OK. Now, while this looks incredibly similar to our block proc, we're going to go ahead and make one critical change here, and that is we're going to add one more text display object just after block instructions, and this one's going to be called wait for scanner. There we go, for scanner. Now what this is going to be doing is this is actually going to be waiting for a pulse from the scanner in order to go ahead and begin these trials, because we want them to remain consistent. We want it to we really want it to wait for the scanner to happen, or for the scanner to send that pulse in order to say, okay, we're ready to start recording now. So this one's actually going to be very simple. Like I said, I kind of make these to be templates. So I'm going to just say waiting for a scanner. All right, so first, just says waiting for scanner, very simple. The screen can either be blank, a fixation, or on the experimenter's display. Now, I say that because, you know, you can have this be whatever you want. We can have it be a fixation. It can be on the experimenter's display, so only the experimenter sees that, oh, hey, we're waiting for the pulse to happen, or waiting for the scanner, or the screen can be completely blank. It's entirely up to your research. We leave that much up to you. This just kind of acts as a template or kind of placeholder text. And then we have press Z to continue. Now, Z seems like a strange choice until you know how our Celeritas unit responds to triggers from the scanner. It actually responds by pretending to press the Z key on the keyboard. And that's how we're kind of setting this experiment up, because, I mean, you know, obviously we're going to want to plug Celeritas as much as we can. But if you have, you know, your own way that that pulse comes in from the scanner, then definitely set your input masks up to wait for that pulse instead of for ours. So to do this, what we're going to have to do is go ahead and click on the properties page here. Click on duration input. We'll change the duration to infinite. Change that data logging to standard. That way we get the time the timestamp when that pulse came in. We're going to add a keyboard input mask and change that to an allowable of Z. Go ahead and click apply and OK. So now this is literally just going to stay on the screen until it gets that pulse from that scanner, which is going to be a good way to kind of time this out, or to start all the timing for this object. Now all we need to do now in our block list is we need to kind of follow that same structure before. So we had prac trialist, so this one's going to have something extremely similar, literally just called trialist. So to add that to our experiment, all I'm going to do is take a list object, put it after my wait for scanner object, And I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to trial list and hit enter there. Now my trial list is just going to be pretty boring, honestly. It's going to be the same thing as my prac trial list, but I'm just going to change the weight of the objects in there. So my procedure here is just going to be called trial, or yeah, I'm just going to call this one trial proc. There we go, trial proc. I'm going to hit enter. Doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course. Would I like to make the default value for newly created levels? I'm not going to make any anymore, but we'll click yes anyway. And then instead of having a weight of 3, I'm just going to change the weight of this to 4, so this runs 4 times. So they're doing a total of 7. Now to open my trial proc, this is actually going to look pretty similar to the last trial proc here, where I have my fixation object. This is actually just going to have another little bit of inline script in it. Now the point of this inline script is it's actually going to be first off, resetting some of the data that's the first thing we're going to do, but it's also going to be handling a lot of the timing that we'll be doing in this as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add an inline object as the first object in my experimental timeline. And this one's just going to be called reset cycle data. Now the purpose of reset cycle data is it's actually just going to take all of my variables and it's going to basically refresh them. It's going to make sure that they're all ready for collecting data a little while later. So in my reset cycle data, the first thing I want to do is I want to set that bool end to trial, or block end, sorry. I want to set that variable, and I want to take that and set that to false. Now I'm setting it to false before any of the critical trials run, because if we do the rest of the script correctly, what's going to happen is it's actually going to end up setting this to true. Setting this bool block end to true, and if we don't set it to false anywhere else, once we make a correct series of responses into one of the trials, it's just going to run through the other couple automatically because we're not resetting this variable. So it's very important to reset right there. And then we're going to go ahead and set the rest of the object's duration as well. So I'm going to have if c.getAttrib. And this is going to look a little redundant, but I only need access to every trial after the first one. In order to gain access to every trial after the first one, I need to get at an attribute specifically called running. And that doesn't actually show up in our little attrib sense there. And I'll just use a little ampersand there. I'll tell you what I did in just a second. So what I'm doing is I'm actually getting the value of an attribute that's returning, or getting the value of two things kind of pushed together. So my attribute is actually going to be called running and then just a sample number. So it's going to be my running list and the dot sample here. And I'm actually that's the attribute name itself. Now to do that, I need to actually concatenate these two things. So running is going to be changing all the time. My running is just the name of the list that's running, and dot sample, running dot sample together ends up giving me the sample number that I'm currently on of my trial list object. And that's obviously going to change every single time, but the very first time that I run it, it's of course going to be set to 1 because it's going to be the first trial. So this is just going to let us know what trial we're currently on, and then if it's greater than 1, that means we're not on our first trial. Now, since we're on our first trial, none of those variables have actually been changed at any point, so we don't need to change them any further. But if we're in our second run, we need to make sure that all these variables are, like I said, kind of refreshed or set back to their default value. So I'm going to first focus on that ln start time. So ln start, no, sorry. I spelled that really wrong. There we go. ln start time, I'm going to set that equal to ln end time, and then I'm going to set ln end time equal to the start time plus 20,000. Whoops, and I typed 20,000 wrong. There we go, so 20,000. And then I'm just going to put a very simple end if statement there. Now what this is doing is, and it might look a little different at first, but you have to kind of think of the script as a whole function. So, or kind of in sequence with the rest of the script that I might have there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the value of the start time to the value of the end time. Now the value of the end time is actually set in the previous trial. So the last time they pressed all of those buttons, they have that ln end time, which was the time that the last trial started plus 20,000. So this is actually going to be set already for us, and we need just the start time to basically refresh and say, okay, this is going to be the start time, and since it begins again once the last trial ended, the start time is of course going to be equal to the last trial's end time. And we need to go ahead and refresh once we've done that, set the value of this end time. So if the last trial's end time is this trial's start time, then this trial's end time needs to be its current start time plus 20,000. So this is going to make sure that we maintain consistency in the duration of all of our block objects. Or sorry, in the duration of all of our blocks. So now that I did that reset cycle data, now things are going to start to look a little similar. We can start doing that nice little drag and drop method that I like to do so much. So I'm going to go ahead and take fixation, and I'm going to take it from my prac trial proc and put it right in my critical proc. And then I'm going to go ahead and take that sound out begin, put that there. I'm going to go ahead and make another sublist. And I'm going to actually make a new one here. And this one I'm just going to rename to sublist. There we go. And then I'm going to finish out this procedure here by just having my sound out end at the end as well. Now let's go ahead and jump into sublist here. And this sublist is going to be extremely similar to our subprac list. The only difference is we're going to kind of take the word prac off of things. So in my procedure here, I'm just going to call this one subcritical proc. Hit enter. Doesn't exist, but I like to create it. Would I like to make a default value for newly created levels? Sure. And similar to that subprac list that we had made, this weight is going to actually be 3 as well. I'm going to change this one to 3. And then this object is, or this procedure is going to be really quick to make because it's going to look very, very similar to what I had before. The difference is I'm just not going to have an inline or this feedback object. It's going to take my record write object from my practice. I'm going to take my record left from my practice. I'm actually going to do a new check responses inline object because if you notice, my check responses inline object is specifically looking at this subprac list and it's terminating that. So I actually need very similar script, but I need to change that line. And if I go ahead and copy and paste like I had done before, it's not going to change that line for me like I want. So I want a new inline object here. And this one is actually just going to be called, you see the last one was called check responses. We'll go ahead and call this one check critical responses. And then just for the sake of speed here, I'm going to go ahead and select all of the script here by pressing Control A and then Control C to copy. Jump into my check critical responses and hit Control V to paste. Now I have my record right.input mask, my record left.input mask. This isn't, where is that inline? I have it, here you go. I have it checking if it's practice. So practice is currently set to no. So right now I'm basically just flagging that whenever this happens, I need to be ending my task here. And all I need to do to change this is just change this terminate trial list so no more trials are run. It was called subprac list, and this one's just called sublist. So I'm going to get rid of the word prac in the middle there so it references the correct list object. And now we're just doing a list object dot terminate, which is going to end that. And then this is set feedback for practice. We don't have feedback. We're not in practice. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this. And that's all I need to do there. The only thing I need to add now is my goodbye object. Because if we look here, these two objects are identical, or these two procedures are identical with the exception of the fixation or the feedback object there. My check critical responses inline object is now referencing the correct set of E objects. So all I need to do then is hop into my session proc, go ahead and take a text display object, and that was the wrong place to put it. I'm going to go ahead and actually put it after the block list here, and I'm just going to call this one goodbye display. And I'm just going to write a very simple message to participants here, just thank you very much. Wow, there we go. See what happens when I try to type while I talk while I type. Thank you very much for your participation. Please let the researcher know you are done. And that's it. I don't really need to change any of the properties of this object. I'll have it set to 1,000 milliseconds. That's completely fine. I am actually going to go ahead and change my duration input tab here, though, to log time audit only. We'll click apply and OK. And that's all we need to do. Now we've set up a finger tapping task. So thank you guys very much for following along and for watching. If you guys have absolutely any questions, please feel free to let me know. I am absolutely always happy to answer any questions. Either go ahead and leave a comment on this video. I'm happy to answer those there. Or if you have a kind of complex question, you want to change this task in a couple of very fundamental ways and it might involve a couple more steps, please feel free to go to support.psnet.com. That is our product service and support site. Go ahead and make a ticket by clicking submit a ticket at the top of the page. We are always happy to help. There's a task that you'd like to see me make. If you find that, oh, next semester I'm going to be making this task and you haven't done it yet and I'm not sure how to do it in ePrime, by all means, go ahead and leave me a comment under this video, and I'm more than happy to make that task for you. That actually was something that we'd done last Thursday, and next Thursday I'm actually doing another task as requested by a user. So, we are getting a lot of these requests in, and I'm really happy to be doing these things, so definitely please let me know. If you like what you see today, like me to keep walking through experiments like this, feel free to like and subscribe on the video. I'm always happy to see that kind of feedback. And otherwise, thank you guys very much for watching, and have a great day.